and a warm welcome to this media workshop on the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China, as it's officially called. I am Claudia Wessling, Director Communications and Publications at MERICS, and I will be your host in the next hour, in which our experts will provide you with information and their takes on the Party Congress. Before we get started, a few housekeeping rules. We will be recording the presentation in this session to make it available online afterwards. Please note the Q&A session will not be available as a recording, so you are very free to ask even difficult questions to our experts. Everything that is said as a principle will be on the record. If our experts would want to have something off the record, they would flag this accordingly when they speak. Presentation, as I said, will be recorded and will be on the record anyways. So, the National Congress of the Communist Party that will kick off in Beijing on Sunday with about 2,300 delegates attending is the event to watch in China right now. And at the one-week meeting, Xi Jinping is poised for a third term as General Secretary. He will allow insights into his political agenda for the next 5 years with his work report. And we are expecting a few personnel changes in the Politburo and the Standing Committee. As a first step, just yesterday, the 19th Central Committee of the CCP wrapped up its 7th and final plenary session in the lead up to the Party Congress, and its communique that was published online yesterday gives a few clues about what to expect. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of Xi talk in this document about his importance as the core of the CCP and everything. And our experts here have taken more than one close look into the planning of the Party Congress in the last weeks and last days even. And yeah, let me introduce you to the expert we have gathered here today. Our speakers, we have Jacob Gunter here. Jacob is a senior analyst in our economics team, and he will cover the economic aspects of the Party Congress for you and also give us a bit of an outlook on what expects Xi after his power reinvigoration at the Party Congress. We have Nis Grünberg. He's a lead analyst in our politics and society team. He's our expert for everything Xi and especially personnel issues surrounding the Party Congress. And of course, he does a lot of research on the party itself. Just as Valarie Tan, last but not least, analyst also in our politics and society team. She closely follows all CCP meetings and will introduce you to topics to watch at the forthcoming Congress. How do we go about this workshop? Our experts will do a short presentation for you to lead you into the main subjects and their takes on it. Afterwards, there will be ample time to ask questions. How do you do that? You can either raise your hand in the reactions button on Teams. This is not Zoom, this is Teams. And I would just ask you to speak up, or you can also write a written question into the chat and we will look at it and try to answer it to the best of our abilities. Okay, that said, without further ado, I would hand it over to my esteemed colleague Nis to kick off the presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia, and welcome. Good afternoon, also from my side. I'll just very quickly go through 2 slides. One you can see here, where I discuss the personnel issues that are at stake and the kind of key dynamics that we are looking at. A few very careful projections in terms of what that will mean, what the Congress will mean for policy. And another slide on the musical chairs behind the standing committee options that we are we are looking at the options. So in terms of personnel, what of course everyone has been discussing is how will the new standing committee look? The 7 men, including Xi Jinping, that stand at the apex of the Communist Party. So there's a possibility that the size will be shrunk or even enlarged. You might remember that Xi Jinping himself cut the number of people in the standing committee of the Politburo from 9 to 7 when he commenced his first term. Some people say he could shrink it to 5. That would, kind of cement his power even more. You could also enlarge it in order to get a bit more fresh blood into the leadership. Both possibilities are there, but at MERICS we don't see them as very likely. The more interesting thing that we're looking at is probably the promotion or retirement rule. So until now, past 20 years, give or take, there was this unwritten rule or a norm that you should retire once you are above 68. So that will mean if they still stick to that rule and Xi Jinping can rewrite the rules, he has the power to do so. That would mean that 10 people in the Politburo would have to retire and 2 in the Standing Committee. I would argue that a larger turnover would mean a benefit for Xi because he gets to promote more of his supporters from Politburo into the Standing Committee and even into the Politburo. There are arguments for how he could ignore or change these rules. He could, for example, shift to retirement at 67. That would open a few spots more and kind of open up a little bit more wiggle room for him to get his own men into the Politburo. What is clear, however, I think, is that regardless of the retirement rules or however this will fall, Xi is going to be pretty much in charge of everything at the top level. There are no real other factions, the Communist Youth League and so on. All these other centers of power, these other networks have been kneecapped really over the past 10 years, and there's no real opposition that we can detect that is organized or can be dangerous to him. So he really runs the show at this top level. If you look at all the facts that we can get, it's of course a black box, so there's never 100% certainty, but it sure doesn't look like there's any challenge to him. So all in all, personnel-wise, we expect a very strong majority of Xi loyalists in Politburo and Standing Committee, and in a bit I will go through some of these candidates. Policy-wise, it's very difficult to say anything specific about the outcome. It's the party Congress is a party for the party. It's to laud the achieved victories over COVID and so on. The work report that Xi Jinping will present when he's opening the Congress on Sunday will be a lot on the good deeds that he's been doing and then look a little bit into the future to give the key themes of the next 5 years without really revealing too much on concrete policy. What's pretty clear is that, we can see this already in the readout from the 7th plenum and in the preparatory documents, the last Politburo meeting and so on, everything really points at a very clear continuation of the Xi Jinping style ideology-driven politics that we have seen the past 5-10 years. It's not clear if common prosperity by name will be the theme of the Congress, but I think my colleagues also share the expectation that inequality and really reestablishing a type of stability in society and the economy really is takes the forefront. I just read through the 7th plenum document, and in the section on Taiwan, for example, which is very timid, it says that domestic issues are requiring a lot of attention right now, and that really tells you that they know they are in deep trouble at home. So I think some type of redistribution of resources and prosperity narrative will certainly be important in Xi Jinping's speech. What we know is that there are constitutional changes that are looming. I think my colleague Valarie will say a sentence or two on these. Of course, this will mainly be about Xi Jinping and his position as the core of the power structure and the core of ideology. Strongly expect a declaration of victory over COVID and a continuation of the zero COVID or dynamic clearing strategy as it is named now, also after the Congress. And of course, the kind of bite your teeth and continue to chip in for the national rejuvenation of China, putting China on a road to dominance in 2035 and 49. What is always very interesting in the document that will come out, the work report, is the so-called problem page, It's where, you know, warnings will surely follow on the unprecedented challenges and the struggles that are ongoing in society. This will really be where we can see how serious the leadership, the party leadership, takes the current crisis that China is in. In terms of concrete policy, as I said, there's not much to be had usually. That will have to wait until the NPC, the National People's Congress, will meet in March on March 5th next year, when the government will be restructured and the new posts in the government will be revealed. This will also show us then how much really the party dominance in state administration has taken over. So just very quickly, the three dimensions of Xi Jinping's power in which we really see him developing the party state and developing his own position is ideology. Xi Jinping thought as the key principle of governance, the constitutional changes will essentially make what Xi says into what the party must do. The two establishers, Valarie will talk about this a little bit more, will probably be enshrined. And I think that we are in for more campaigns to foster nationalism, also outwards. Xi Jinping stands for a very strong party, so discipline, campaigns, and more party building will certainly be part of his program for the next 5 years, especially the expansion of disciplinary control. People forget sometimes that the Party Congress is in part also the Congress for the Central Discipline Inspection Commission. So his personal, or well, it's not personal, but the disciplinary apparatus that Xi has been very smart in using to both fight corruption, but also really discipline the party state. Many more cadres have been punished for violation of discipline, which very often means ideological discipline, than have been charged with corruption. So that is going to be a very important part of the conference also. And securitization, of course, security means a lot to Xi, is really the growing concept that global position of China is seen in. It means both security of the regime, the party, social security, economic security, but also an increase in a more assertive foreign policy. Okay, yeah, now you can go to the next slide, please. So just to, very quickly, I won't go too much into detail. You're free to ask more questions about this later, but the main candidates for higher office we have arranged here. So the three big crosses are those that we expect to retire from the standing committee. Those are Han Zheng and Li Zhanshu, because of age limitations. So they are older than 68. They will most likely go. Li Keqiang, the current premier, he has to vacate his position as premier because when Xi Jinping changed the rules to enable him to stay for more than 2 terms as president, he didn't change those rules for Li Keqiang. So the premier needs to go after 2 terms, and it's very unlikely that Li Keqiang will stay. He's a relatively weak candidate in the setup. It's very unlikely, in my mind, that he will stay in the Politburo Standing Committee. So that will mean at least 3 vacancies. Who are or maybe another word on Wang Huning. He is 67, as is Wang Yang. Both could in principle stay should the 67-68 rule stick. But as I said, a larger turnover would be a benefit for Xi because he then gets to promote more of his candidates of choosing. Wang Yang is discussed as one of the potential candidates for the next premiership, is a good possibility. Wang Huning, very weak candidate in the standing committee. He's the main ideology writer and speechwriter of Xi Jinping. I personally see him retire. So the candidates, Li Xi, a Xi loyalist, he's the current party secretary of Guangdong province. Deng Xuexiang, he's one of Xi's most trusted allies in the central administration. He's the director of the party's Central Committee General Office, so he controls the information flow, he organizes the meetings and so on, and also is the head of Xi Jinping's personal office. So very important person that I see moving into the standing committee. Li Qiang, also an important ally of Xi. He is in Shanghai at the moment. He watched the COVID response there, so people some argue for he's been weakened because his botched response to COVID there, but still has a chance, I think, and he has a good track record to step in for Han Zheng as the first vice premier. Chairman he's the party secretary of Chongqing province. He managed to go through that office, which is very often tied to demotion and corruption. Not a lot of people that stay in Chongqing are kind of untouched by any scandal. And he also knows Xi Jinping from his time in Zhejiang. So also very old, trusted candidate, one of the younger people that in theory can stay 2 terms more. The same goes for Hu Chunhua. He's the only person on this picture that is not, or amongst these potential candidates, that is not a Xi Jinping ally. He's a very, in my mind, very good premier candidate. He is, he sticks out talking about unemployment, about youth unemployment and socioeconomic issues, which is really the portfolio of a premier. So that really makes him an ideal candidate for that spot. Also, the fact that he could be a sign of counterbalancing and showing that not only Xi's personal loyalists are important, but also more moderate candidates. He Lifeng, he's a good candidate for taking over from Liu He to run economic planning in the Politburo. I don't see him moving up to the to the standing committee, but he's probably staying on as the main economic planner. He's now in the National Development and Reform Commission, one of the most important industry and infrastructure planning commission. And then finally, Huang Kunming, also a very strong candidate for the next standing committee. He's the propaganda czar. He's running the propaganda department of the party. He's been an important person behind pushing party ideology on people's mobile phones in the digital realm, and also really long-time follower, quite literally a follower of Xi Jinping's. He was a colleague both in Fujian province and in Zhejiang province, and moved in a way offices where Xi Jinping moved. So these are our favorites, but happy to discuss more a bit later. Just one final word on these 2 guys that hang up on the right side. Wang Qishan, he's the vice president, an important fixer. He's not a formal member of the standing committee, but kind of an 8th wheel on the 7-horse chariot. He's quite old, so he's bound to retire, and potentially his kind of fixer role is being taken over by Liu He, who's right now running economic macro planning. All right, over to you, Valarie.
Thanks, Nis. So far, Nis has basically shown you how Xi Jinping consolidates power by putting his best friends, or the people he trusts the most, in top leadership positions. I'm going to talk about another tool that further expands Xi's control over the party and over China's policies, and that is the party constitution. At every Congress, changes have been made to the constitution, and this time it will be no different. It's highly likely we will see more slogans that center around Xi's core leadership and his brand of guiding ideology and his ideas added to the party constitution. Exactly what? We'll find out in about a week's time. So far, it has held his cards very close to his chest, but it is highly possible we'll see the inclusion of this, what I call the 2442 slogans. The first of all, the 2 establishers are very likely to make it into the constitution. I know they sound really funny to us. They don't make any sense at all. There's some head scratching every time some of these new slogans come out, but they become less funny once they enter into the party constitution, because they become powerful tools for Xi, essentially because the party constitution is a legal document. Anything put inside can then be used to buttress that kind of legal basis for Xi to justify using force to diffuse any tension in the party state and to take down any opposition within the party state. So those who run afoul of all these Xi Jinping ideas can be officially deemed as in violation of party rules. Because we have to remember, the party constitution is kind of like the preeminent rule book for every party member to follow stringently, and is also a guiding blueprint for China policy. So the document gives ideas by Xi Jinping, his ideology and his leadership, greater legitimacy and greater legal basis and support. We could also see other concepts that have been proliferated by Xi, included in the party constitution. For example, like the new development concept, perhaps common prosperity. And he has also floated this idea of the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative. Again, these things will really come to the forefront, the surface at the end of the Congress. But exactly what changes will be included in the party constitution can also tell you how much support and any form of resistance in the party to adopt wholesale Xi's ideas. And it's also important to remember that previously changes to the party constitution is kind of like a routine exercise. It's kind of like to reflect a change in leadership and for past leaders to lead their legacy. We saw this with Hu Jintao, we saw this with Jiang Zemin. But under Xi, he has really revived the party constitution as a powerful political tool to further expand his control and influence over the party state. And then we go on to the next slide. So essentially, if you think about the Congress, it's quite a paradox. If we can go on to the next slide, please. Xi is going to come out of the Congress really very powerful, but the country that he is in charge of is in trouble. And I think this is a nice lead to what Jacob will present later on the economic troubles facing China. China faces multiple crises on many fronts, one of which is the coming demographic crisis. And this underlines a lot of major implications for China's future economic and social development. I would argue here the root cause of it, there are many drivers for why we are entering into a demographic crisis in China, but one of the root causes is the lack of women representation in elite politics. Women make up 49% of China's population, and yet women make up less than 1/3 of CCP party membership and less than 8% of senior leadership positions. Only one woman on the 25-member Politburo, Sun Chunlan, 72, she's set to retire, and the party is not obliged to appoint another woman as replacement. So what does this mean? It means that issues faced by nearly half of China's population are not addressed. That's lack of enforcement, when it comes to domestic abuse, violence against women in public places. We've seen this in terms of all the high-profile cases that have made it to the news this year. And all these adds up, and it really puts women off from having babies. So far, what the government has done is to really throw money at the problem. But there are bigger, non-financially driven structural issues not addressed by a deeply seated patriarchal party who has, under Xi, also framed feminists and advocates of women's rights as threats to social instability in China. So the outlook is definitely not optimistic for women, as I've said earlier on, with the high-profile cases of violence and harassments against women. So women put in this very precarious economic and social state in China. This doesn't bode well for birth rates, and it doesn't bode well for China's future economic and social development. Surveys, numbers have pointed to population decline accelerating in China, further exacerbated by the zero-COVID policy. So you will see economic insecurity, social uncertainty, really backing up or convincing women that, you know, there's no reason for them to have more than one children or have children at all. And zero COVID just adds to that. As one very famous Chinese demographer puts it, zero COVID, zero marriages, zero fertility. And one thing to note as well, China's National Population Research Center is set to release a survey on marriage and babies right after the party congress. So there'll be some data there to show you how ground sentiment is like when it comes to like getting married and having kids and what this means for China's future. And I think that sets up quite nicely for you, Jacob, when it comes to presenting the economic challenges faced by China. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, so first I'll start off by presenting a bit about the challenges and then what we might expect from Xi at the Party Congress relating to economic policy. Though, as Nis accurately pointed out, we're not going to see really hard, tangible policies coming out. It's more policy signaling. So starting with the situation facing Xi as he enters his third term, he's going to have to respond to what is effectively the rockiest economy that Beijing has faced in decades. Here we have on the left, we have GDP growth, both historically and with some projections. And that's even with the optimistic projection that they are able to achieve their 5.5% goal for GDP growth this year, which is at this point effectively going to be impossible without some sort of economic miracle hitting in Q4. We'll get the Q3 economic data early next week. I anticipate it will be incredibly bad news as we've seen the zero COVID approach to lockdowns. And even in a place like Shanghai, where it's not technically under the kind of lockdown it was just a few months ago, everything that we see and hear on the ground is that it's effectively half under lockdown. So GDP growth has become much lower over time and over Xi Jinping's period of rule, but also it's become incredibly volatile the last several years because of the pandemic, but also because of China's response to the pandemic. The real estate aspect, which you can see on the graph to the right, which has historically been a really important driver of growth, has also been very, very volatile. We have these periods of volatility across this entire chart going all the way back to the early 2000s. What you don't have is such massive swings in quite such short time frames. What's important to note is that sort of second to last down or decline, that was with the initial lockdowns. And then we saw a pretty strong recovery, and then it spiked like crazy. And right around that same time, that's when Xi Jinping started to really crack down on the real estate sector, on property speculation, and all things related to the property sector. And it's only then that we see this really sharp decline, and then yet a secondary kind of decline once COVID starts to also kick back across the country. So this incredibly important driver of growth is at effectively an all-time low point across several of these factors, at least for Xi Jinping's time and power. And then move to the next slide, please. So we also see that Xi Jinping's efforts to drive towards a more consumption-driven economy is not going the way that he wants it to. So here on the left, we have on the red line preference for more savings, and the yellow line is employment sentiment. As expected, Q1 of 2020, savings goes up, employment sentiment goes down. It starts to recover over the next several quarters. And then we basically just see things get worse and worse steadily throughout this kind of the second half of 2021 all the way up till now, to the point where they're so far diverged from one another and moving into such negative territory that it really begs the question of what consumer and employee confidence still exists within China. And that preference for more savings really means less consumption. And that employment sentiment adds to that aspect of wanting to save more, wanting to prepare for economic hardship, which is the exact opposite of what Xi Jinping wants in the economy. We also see here in the purchasing managers index on the right, a very important distinction between the manufacturing side of the economy and the services side. So from what we hear anecdotally from companies on the ground, most companies have been able to find ways to kind of keep their operations going if you're in manufacturing, and especially if you're for manufacturing and you're doing it for export. So we don't see the same kind of volatility and sentiment on the manufacturing side of things. However, on the services side, which is going to be almost entirely domestic consumption, you don't really export that much in terms of services. We see things just truly plummeting. Both in terms of services in general, but also in terms of new orders especially. And again, this really speaks to a collapse in consumer confidence. That again, this is not being driven like it is in the West by inflation or shortages of certain materials and such. This is the zero COVID policy, and the consequences thereof. So we'll move to the next slide, please, and talk a bit about how those realities match up against what we can expect Xi to talk about in terms of his economic platform at the Party Congress. So first, kind of at the 30,000 foot level, if we look back at both of the previous big speeches that Xi gave at his previous Party Congresses, what we see is a fair amount of the kind of laundry list of economic policy making agenda. It's a little bit of everything. But of course, it's not the fluff that matters. There are certain gems within it that will matter more than others. And overall, from that 30,000 foot perspective, I think that what we can then clearly identify is Xi Jinping as a continuity man, and continuity of his current economic trajectory means less pragmatism and more ideology, as Nis pointed out, and more focusing on a couple of key goals related to the securitization of the economy against external threats and the de-risking of the economy domestically. So from that economic ideology perspective, I expect that we might hear a bit more about Xi Jinping economic thought. This emerged in June by name in Qiu Shi. And as often happens with these things, it starts off with kind of some core concepts and a little bit of text, and then it's up to everybody to figure out what it means. And so we'll likely see some of that expanded upon throughout the Party Congress and then thereafter. But we already see certain elements of ideology taking more and more central of a role in economic policy making. And a really clear example of this is all this terminology around common prosperity. We heard this, we saw this term emerge recently, and the challenging thing about it is that from a corporate perspective, they weren't entirely sure how to deal with this because it was an ideologically driven concept rather than a specific rule or regulation. A rule or regulation is really easy to comply with because there's kind of a binary sense of how you comply with that. But if you have a more ideologically driven approach to the economy in which there's all this language about common prosperity and tertiary distribution of rich people and well-to-do companies meant to play more of a role in social development and equality, that's more of a spectrum, and there's more need for interpretation. And if you're a company, you would much rather have a binary compliance strategy than a spectrum of an ideological adherence policy. And the same thing goes for policymakers and Chinese officials. They're going to have to become better and better at interpreting ideology rather than simply implementing policy and rules and regulations. Moving to the second point, securitization against external risks. One big thing I suspect we'll hear more about is the importance of dual circulation strategy. It's Xi Jinping's big idea to move away from an export-driven growth model towards a domestic consumption-driven growth model. There's nothing revolutionary about that. Every country wants that. Xi Jinping isn't some special economic philosopher for coming up with this idea. But what is important is how they might want to achieve that. But also equally important is the fact that they keep pushing this idea, but it keeps going nowhere because the economy is fundamentally broken because of zero COVID. As was shown in those charts, savings rates are up, consumption rates are down. Consumer confidence is absolutely in the dumps, which is the exact opposite of this. And importantly, throughout the pandemic and throughout all the lockdowns, export growth has actually been a really key driver of overall GDP growth rate. That's really helped prop it up. And now that we're going to see kind of slowing demand for China's exports, this might drive greater urgency. But unfortunately, all the policy signaling in the world isn't going to boost consumer confidence for people in lockdown in a consumer city like Shanghai. We'll also probably see another external risk, which is the trade and technology wars coming up. This is going to be a lot of talk about self-reliance and indigenous innovation to become less reliant on the United States and its allies for technology. And I think that will be made much, much more urgent because of the new regulations that came out of the US in regards to certain export controls towards China. And lastly, we'll probably see some focus as well on managing certain internal challenges. There's been a pretty strong effort to reduce a lot of these domestic risks over the last couple of years. This is what a lot of the crackdowns have broadly meant. Some of these have had a pretty poor track record in 2022, such as the debt reduction and deleveraging efforts, especially at kind of the local and provincial government level, where that has very much been reversed by the need for quick and urgent stimulus. to keep the economy's kind of baseline going. But there are a lot of other priorities that will continue to matter. So I showed the data there on the previous slide about the real estate markets. I think this is going to be an area where Xi Jinping continues to push hard. That he will continue with this mantra of homes are for living and not for speculation. This is something he's said for a long time. It's not something that he will easily back away from. And he's not wrong to prioritize the real estate market in terms of risks. The key issue is that when you want to pursue your aggressive zero COVID policy, and you want to pursue self-reliance, and you want to boost indigenous innovation, and you want to, increase party control over economic actors, at a certain point, you have a finite amount of resources and a finite amount of options. And to add to the list the real estate market, which is such an important driver of growth, really mitigates any efforts to kind of keep the economic ship moving in the right direction. And then lastly, we'll see similar things on the financial markets. This term, the disorderly expansion of capital, I suspect that we'll continue to hear that. And that's not only to try to manage financial risks, but it's also, frankly, related to the other goals, like the self-reliance campaign and indigenous innovation, that not only do you not want a disorderly expansion of capital blowing up, these tech unicorns that aren't necessarily providing any strategic value from Beijing's perspective. Not only do you want that capital moving suddenly into that, but you would prefer to be able to direct it into the kind of technologies and the kind of companies that are aligned with the CCP's strategic goals. So I'll leave it at that. And I think I'm handing it off now to Claudia again.
Yes, thank you, Jacob. And thank you, Valarie and Nis, also for your introductory thoughts and insights into the Party Congress